Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think I've been a few times in Taiwan, but these years I can celebrate the 44 times years visit because my first visit was in 1980. So we started balloon angioplasty in September 79. And I was invited not to talk about balloon angioplasty, but at that time to talk about nifedipine, a calcium antagonist. And I was with Jim Muller, who was the Nobel Prize for Peace, and we really enjoyed this first visit at that time. But in the meantime, I had the pleasure to have Sun Ching as a fellow. He's more than a fellow. He's going to pass his PhD thesis in Rotterdam in February, so you should wish him good luck for this endeavor. So today we are going to talk about many things. You see the title that I receive is quite impressive. I have to say something about the syntax tool, the talent, the multi-vessel talent, and finish on the FDA-IDE SYNTAX IV Trial. That's really a lot of new concept. So this is the overview. Every time I put the number of slides that I'm going to present, don't be worried about that. It will go quite fast. But first, the lesson learned from the SYNTAX I trial. I think it's important because I have a very long-term follow-up of my patient. And that's very, very important to understand that. This is a title of a paper published this year with Frederick Moore in JACC Asia. That's a very good journal. I'm sure it will be very good. And the title of that paper was 10 Years of Syntax, Closing an Era of Clinical Research After Identifying New Outcome Determinant. That's a central illustration. But this is much more important because it shows that we are working since now more than 25 years on predicting the outcome of the patient with multi-vessel disease. I will come back on that in more detail. But the first question is, what did we learn from the multi-vessel talent? And every time the slide will be there for 30 seconds, because in that paper I'm quoting 24 sub-analyses. As a matter of fact, there was the double 48, but that's in the reference in the paper. And tonight I will review 19 of these slides in 10 minutes, so good luck. The first point is all-cause mortality at 10 years according to sex. And as you could see, women have a worse outcome than men, irrespective of PCI of bypass surgery. At 10 years, 32.8 mortalities versus 24.7. And it's mainly the last 5 years in the landmark analysis. But what is very interesting is that if you look PCI female versus CABG female, at 5 years, I was very much impressed by the difference. PCI for female was worse than bypass surgery. But as you could see, with time, the curve merged, and at 10 years, there is no more difference between female and female PCI and female CABG. However, same rate of survival does not mean same rate of survival, because the area under the curve is also important. But what is important is that initially PCI was worse than bypass, and then you could see in the last 5 years a swap of the curve. PCI became better than bypass surgery. Interesting. Diabetes, big topic, all-cause mortality at 10 years in patients with diabetes mellitus. You see a little bit the same phenomenon. At 5 years, bypass surgery in red is much better than PCI. But at 10 years, they merge. Probably is the worn-out phenomenon of the saphenous vein graft. As you could see in these landmark study, there is a reverse of the curve. First, bypass surgery is better than PCI, but in the last 5 years, PCI is better than bypass surgery. I will tell you, and this slide is very important, there is different curve. You could see in blue, insulin-treated diabetes PCI is the worst, with a mortality of 47.8%. The second one is insulin-treated diabetes cabbage, and it's somewhat better, but not significantly better, 39.6. And then you have no insulin treated by diabetes, but diabetes PCI or cabbage, but no insulin, and they are on the same curve. That's something important. It's published in the European Heart Journal. I had a hard time to publish that. I got all the non-invasive cardiologists, which is very convinced that all diabetes should not be treated by PCI, and that's nonsense. Insulin is really the difficult group. All-cause mortality at 10 years in elderly versus not in the elderly, defined by more than 70 years of less than 70 years. And as you could see in both groups, the log rank p-value is not significant, and the interaction is also not significant. This is the mortality PCI and cabbage above 70, 44%. The age play a role. And this is in less than 70. As you could see, PCI at the mortality is somewhat higher than cabbage, but not significant. If you ask me the adjusted hazard ratio for 10 years all-cause death according to age at the time of the randomization, the crossover of the two curves for the hazard ratio is at 78 years. That's a moment where PCI get better than bypass surgery, always big overlap. This is interesting, all-cause mortality at 10 years with respect to body composition indices. You have the body mass index, and you have WC, the waist circumferences. Now, it's interesting that the people with low BMI die more than the patient with high BMI. So it's better to be a little bit obese for bypass surgery and PCI. Now, if you look here, the waist circumference, that's a different story. If you have a high waist circumference, then you have a bad outcome versus the people with low waist circumference. Now, who is the good guy? The good guy is the guy who has a high BMI and a low waist circumference. It looked like an athlete, if on my cartoon. And that's the reference. He has a mortality at 10 years of 19.4%. The worst is the low BMI with a belly, with a high waist circumference. Hazard ratio 2.74, you know, meager and a belly, terrible. This is also not so good, high BMI and high waist circumference. And finally, the low BMI and the low waist circumference have also an hazard ratio 1.65, 1.29. So that's interesting because I didn't know that when we did this study published in the American Journal of Cardiology. This is very important, all-cause mortality at 10 years with respect to biological markers published in Eurointervention. If you have a CRRP above 2 milligrams, you will die more. If you have an hemoglobin below 11 grams, you will die more. It doesn't matter if it is PCI or a cabbage. Hemoglobin A1C, you will also die more. Creatinine below 60 ml, look at the difference in 10 years in mortality. We are in the range of 45 versus 20. HDL 40, that's also something which is, when it is below 40, is not very good. On the other hand, triglyceride more than 150 of LDL more than 70, of course the statin is there, does not impact in the long term. But the thing that I have to emphasize, unbelievable, is that if you never use statin post-PCI or post-bypass surgery, your mortality is 39.1% versus 22.2%. And if you look at, and this is something which is true for the first 5 years and for the last 5 years. If you look at the CRP more than 2 milligram and no statin, your mortality is 42%. If you look at CRP less than 2 milligram and statin therapy, it is 18%. So we interventional cardiologists really has to pay attention about how we treat the secondary prevention. All-cause mortality at 10 years according to the number of established CVD. You could have a problem in the heart, coronary artery disease, but also in the brain, in the vessel of the brain, and at the peripheral vessel. And obviously, if you have established CVD, mortality is high, 31.4 versus 21.7. But you could have one territory disease, for instance, cerebral, or two peripheral, or three with cardiac. You could see that if you have all three, your mortality will be 53.9% at 10 years. And the best group is the group without other established CVD. That's very interesting, published in Circulation last year, 2 years ago. All-cause mortality at 10 years stratified by the SF36, looking at the physical capacity and the mental capacity. You could see this is a patient which is reporting mental health. That's I will see a detail. And this is a patient reporting a poor physical health. So if you take an old lady, frail and depressive, she will do well with PCI compared to cabbage. Look at the two curves. It's interesting, they are superimposed. So old lady, frail, depressive, you can do a PCI even if it's an elderly patient. But if you are dealing with a young CEO of a company, 60 years old, playing golf until he got angina, that guy will do much better with CABG. He will go, he will ask what is the solution, the surgeon will say bypass, he will go through the trauma of the bypass surgery and go back to his company. And as you could see, his mortality at 10 years is 12.2%, while the other has a much higher mortality. This is amazing. Relationship between 10 years mortality per revascularization strategy and region, geographic disparity. We believe that it's all the same everywhere in the world. This is published in the International Journal of Cardiology. As you could see, north of Europe, Scandinavian country, and south of Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, do very well. The patients are equally doing well with PCI and cabbage. But don't forget that in SYNTAX we had the United States, in North America, in West Europe, and East Europe, patients are doing better with cabbage than PCI. This is these 3 points here, United States, West Europe, and East Europe. All-cause mortality at 10 years in patients with and without extensive stenting. Don't put 100 millimeter stent in your patient, you will pay the bill, especially in three-vessel disease. This is the green curve. They have more than 100 millimeter of stenting, mortality 33%. The red curve is the patient without these extensive stenting, 25.9, and cabbage is better. It's not true for the left main. Small stent, don't use it. Stent diameter small of equal to 3. Again, in the three-vessel disease, the PCI with small stent has a mortality of 30% versus large stent, 26, versus bypass surgery, 20.9. All-cause mortality in patients receiving single arterial graft or multiple arterial graft. That's what he published in the European Heart Journal with the surgeon. PCI is not inferior to single graft in left main, diabetic, and anatomic syntax score less than 30. As you could see, the curves are quite superimposed. PCI is not statistically different from single arterial graft in three-vessel disease, non-diabetic, and anatomic syntax score more than 33. But multiple arterial graft is superior to PCI in three-vessel disease, non-diabetic, and with a syntax score above 33. As you could see, every time in the 3VD, the non-diabetic, and the syntax more than 33, the multiple arterial graft is the best. Okay. 10 years all-cause mortality in patients with and without heavy calcification. Heavy calcification is defined in this paper published in JACC Intervention as radiopacity noted on still frame before contrast injection, generalizing, compromising both sides of the arterial lumen in vessel bigger than 1.5 millimeter in diameter with 50% diameter stenosis. And as you could see, that's a big surprise. Patient with heavy calcification undergoing CABG has the worst outcome, 13%. The second one is the PCI with calcification, 34%. The patient without calcification and undergoing PCI, 26%. And finally, the patient without calcification undergoing CABG, 18%. There is no miracle. Is there, it's become difficult for everybody. It's true in the first 5 years, and it's also true in the last 5 years. Bifurcation. Bifurcation is difficult for us and remain difficult for us. You could see here in the continuous line PCI with one or more bifurcation, mortality 30.1%. Then you have here at the bottom 19.8% PCI without any bifurcation, you know, trifocal things and no bifurcation. And then, of course, the CABG with or without bifurcation is the same, 23%. First 5 years, and it's true also the last 5 years. So if you look in the syntax, there were in 1,800 patients, 1,300 with bifurcation. Basically, the equipoise was around 48% of the patient. The half of the patient has to go to surgery, and we're doing better when we had one or two bifurcation. All-cause mortality at 10 years according to the status of total occlusion, recanalization, of revascularization. I'm sure you are going to be disappointed by this slide because in general, PCI or CABG does not impact in the differential way all-cause mortality at 10 years. That's quite sobering, and we have to do better, and we can discuss that in the discussion. Residual syntax score in PCI, you know that we have created a classification 0, less than 4, less than 8, more than 8. If you end up your PCI with a syntax score anatomic more than 8, look at the purple curve here, yeah? Residual syntax score greater than 8 is a killer at 10 years. Finally, all-cause mortality at 10 years with respect to stage PCI. Stage procedure is a marker of complex anatomy, complex procedure, and entail a high mortality. This is this curve with 40%. And finally, all-cause mortality with respect to optimal medical therapy, antiplatelets, statin, angiotensin inhibitors, beta blocker. If you have 3 or 4 of these drugs in secondary prevention, your mortality is around 13%. If you have only 1 or 2 of them, it is 19.9%. And I have already shown you the tremendous difference in statin, okay? 10 years without statin, post-PCR, post-CABG, you have a mortality of 39 versus 22. That was this 19th slide. Now, very shortly, 2 slides on prediction. As you know, I've been working for a long time on prediction. This is a Lancet where we have validated the syntax 2020 versus pre-combat, Freedom, Noble, and Excel. Then in JAC 2021, we make an external validation of the syntax score to 2020 in the Credo Kyoto registry. So I have good data on the Far East population. I know what happens at least in the Japanese trial. And in this trial, they had IVUS in 84%, and they were using the second generation. And this is a paper of last month, Can Machine Learning add the selection of percutaneous versus surgical revascularization? And that's what we call the radar spot. The classical syntax score is there in blue, age, ejection fraction, etc. But there is a few more who were discovered with the machine learning. The hemoglobin A1C, the hemoglobin, the glucose, and the CRP. And you could see that in more detail. And every time that we had something new that we discover through the machine learning, like gamma glutamyl transferase, come on, that's an enzyme of the liver. What does it have to do with the late mortality after PCI of bypass? The only point is a very important enzyme for oxidation of the LDL. And that's the reason why it is there. But I never suspected that. Is by doing the machine learning, taking the 48 parameters in the database that emerge. Yeah. Also, the SF mental, very important. If you are not in a good mental state, you will die after the PCI and bypass surgery. Two slides on the syntax 2. The syntax 2 was based on an analysis of the syntax, and then we did in all three vessels the IFR and the FFR. When the IFR was not convincing, we were using the FFR. So all these vessels had physiological assessment, and then there was implantation of the synergy, and then we were doing an IVUS, and then we were lowering the cholesterol. It is amazing. If you look at 5 years, in the syntax 1, we had a mortality of a MACE rate of 36.4%. Now with this approach, we go down to 23.5. That's the improvement that we have done over the last 10 years. This is what we call the best practice. And you could see that the benefit was also in all-cause death, a reduction of 43%, no impact on stroke, impact on myocardial infarction, a 74% improvement, and in any repeat revascularization, an improvement of 44%. A word about talent and the multi-talent. Talent was an all-comers with the technology of SMT. That was the first big trial of SMT in the field, very beneficial for them because many people, after the publication of the Lancet, start to believe in the domestic Indian technology. And we randomized between Supraflex and the Science, the best in class. And it was a non-inferiority comparison. And you could see we achieved a non-inferiority. You see Doce, TVMI, cardiac death, and clinically indicate TLR. And there was something in the clinically TLR here. So when you look at the per protocol analysis, really the patient will have received either the Science or the Supraflex, you see a p-value. In absolute term, we went from 3.1 to 1.2, and it was a 61% relative reduction. That's in the talent. So what we did, we said, okay, in the talent, we had 1.45 lesion per patient. What happens if we take multiple lesion and multiple vessel, like in the syntax 2 who has 244, 264 lesion. And that's the base of the multi-talent trial that we are going to talk a little bit later on. And we have a primary hypothesis in 1 year, which is the non-inferiority, and a secondary hypothesis at 2 years, which is a reduction in ischemia-driven revascularization. So this is the multi-talent study design, de novo three-vessel disease, screening with the syntax score 1 and 2. Here you have patient favor PCI, patient equipoise, and patient favor cabbage. We took all of them, and then we had the supraflex screws or the synergy. We used the QFR and the IVUS to optimize the result in both groups, and we had 1 month DAPT followed by monotherapy with P2Y12, and I give you the primary endpoint. So this is a cartoon showing we do the QFR centrally. So what John is doing with the whole team, we got the film, and within 2 hours we analyze the film for the investigate, and then send back 10, 12 PPTX with all the information about QFR and other parameters that we will see. Then we do intravascular imaging at the end of the procedure with IVUS and OCT. We have an expert in CTO accredited, and then in terms of medical treatment, we give aspirin prasugrel 1 month and then only prasugrel. What are the attributes of supraflex? It is an ultra-thin struts, and if you look today, there were initially 5 of them. 1 disappeared that we have published in the Lancet, the MyStand. So you have the Orsiro 60 micron, the Supraflex 60 micron, the Biomime 65 micron, and then the Evermin, which has not been really tested in randomized trial, with 50 micron. So you have 4 of them. Now, why is the ultra-thin struts important? This is very sophisticated work that we did with non-Newtonian corpuscular behavior, shear stress looking at this is the struts, 150 micron, like in the Absorb, and you see 2 phenomenon. Here at the top, you have high shear stress, which increase in diastole and reduce in systole, and here we have recirculation. The blood goes in the opposite direction. So on one hand, you get activation of the platelet at the top of the struts, and then they go and stagnate in these recirculation phenomenon. And that gives you an excess of viscosity that we illustrate here. You could see the struts of the scaffold and the viscosity. I will not talk too much about that, but it is very important. You could see the endothelial cell coming in contact with these big struts. They have a difficulty to go above the struts. That's point number 1. And 48 hours later, you see a no man's land here without cell. Why? Because it's all fibrin which is behind the struts. Okay? So that's what happens, accumulation of fibrin in these recirculation place. That's enough for the science. This is a meta-analysis in the European Heart Journal, 16 studies in 20,000 patients. What is really improved by 15% is the target lesion failure, the target vessel failure, and also the clinically driven target lesion revascularization. That's what really you can count. And you could see that the clinically driven target lesion revascularization, that's an improvement of 25%. Now, what are the attributes of the supraflex? I'll tell you, when SMT came and said we have a new design, I said before getting engaged in multi-talent, I want to see the ISO. The ISO is what in the European system for the CE mark, the things that you have to demonstrate before using. But before showing the ISO, what is amazing for me, and I've been in the stenting for more than 35 years, It's the first company who connect valley to valley. Many people and Abbott has connected initially peak to peak, peak to peak. Here we have a long connector, a little bit in a Z format, and it does two things. One thing, improve the pushability, and the second thing, improve the flexibility. That two concept is very important. So that's what attracted me at that time, and I don't know why nobody has think about making a connector valley to valley, why we had to wait 30 years to find that. The second point is that I said to Ganesh, I want to have all the ISO. And this is the crossing profile. You can see the Supraflex is here with 1 millimeter, much better than the Science Expedition of the Ultimaster, very close to the Science Sierra and the Synergy. In terms of foreshortening, is in the three best. Science Sierra do a little bit better, and Osciro do a little bit better, but in the three first. In terms of radial stiffness, is the best one, best than the Osciro, the Synergy, the Expedition, and the Ultimaster. And then something which is very important is taking a stent of 40 millimeter. How much pushability, how much Newton do you have to push to get this system of guiding catheter and all the curve in this coronary artery? And there where the Supraflex is the best because you use a very small force in terms of pushability, better than the Ultimaster, the Orsiro, the Sierra, etc. Now, the last point is very important, the cell design. This is the cell design of the Orsiro, the Science Sierra, the Resolute Integrity, the Promus Premier Select, and the Supraflex screws. So the Supraflex screws has the largest cell area, which is very good for bifurcation if you want to do any type of the bifurcation. And of course, the green area has been adjusted for the same level of expandation. So you remember the protocol. Let's see what we have. So the first things that we do is that we use the iPhone and the SMT program on the iPhone to calculate very quickly the syntax score 2020. All the syntax score are there. The syntax score anatomic, the syntax score 2, the syntax score 2020, the syntax score for multi-slide CT scan. This is a typical patient with the PCI mortality is predicted at 5.1 and the cabbage at 4, so they are equipoise, so you can do both this direction. Nevertheless, if you look at the cumulative frequency curve of the anatomical syntax score in multi-talent, the mean anatomical syntax score is 22.9. And look at this, we have 56% with a syntax score less than 22. We have 32 with an intermediate syntax score, 2332. And we have 12% with a high syntax score, 33. I'm very, very, very curious about what is going to happen with these three. I bet, because that's what we have seen in the meta-analysis that we have done with Jean Bonwall and the TIMI group, I guess, again, this value will indicate the difference between these three stripes. That group remained difficult for us. Of course, that group is justified if you are dealing with a depressive, elderly, poor lady, etc., etc. But otherwise, there are limits about what we can do. Now, quickly, the trial will use the QFR. As you know, the QFR is a combination of three-dimensional angio plus the frame count to look at the velocity of the blood, and then you have this color code gradient assessment. A few pictures. This is the two projection. You get the three-dimensional. You can inspect the three-dimensional in all kind of way. what you have to do after the three-dimensional is look at the velocity. So frame by frame, you analyze the frame count for the blood flow velocity, and in combining three-dimensional angio with the speed of the flow, you have what we call the QFR. And as you could see, there is, this is the slide that we send to the investigator, and we tell them that the vessel QFR, somewhere here, vessel QFR is 0.46, so you should treat. The lesion QFR, at the end of the lesion, you see the lesion here. The blue line is the larger diameter on each cross-section, and the yellow line is the larger diameter, the small diameter on each cross-section. So for instance, here there is a lot of asymmetry. So we can look at the lesion QFR, and what is very interesting, you can do at the QFR at any point, and what is very interesting, you can calculate the residual QFR. So if you put a stent from here to here, what will be the QFR? And as you could see in this case, it will be almost normalized. This is an example of multi-talent focal lesion here, QFR 0.78. This is an LAD at the end 0.80, a little bit borderline, but we will do it. And this is a circumflex of 0.52. You are perfectly justified to do the three vessel. All these slides and many more are sent to all the investigators in Europe, and then we say, do this vessel, don't do that vessel, etc., etc. Now, we are quite far. As you see, we are coming to an end. It is 1550, and we had 1276, so I think in August we will be finished. Some characteristic: age 68, three-quarter male, still smoker, COPD 7%, medically treat diabetes 31% and 10% with insulin, PVD almost 10%, acute coronary syndrome 40% with troponin positive, ejection fraction is okay, the global syntax score by the lab is 22. You see the number of bifurcation, total occlusion, and the intravascular imaging is used in almost all patients. So I'm finishing by something which will be new for you, and we believe very strongly is that could we predict the outcome? Can I anticipate the result of the multi-talent today? So, you know that the QFR post-PCI has to be above 0.91, because if you do this, you have a good result. You have a voce. The PPGI is the physiological pressure gradient index on the pullback curve. And if it is above 0.78, you are dealing with a focal lesion, which is good for us. If it is below 0.78, you have a diffuse lesion. That's difficult for us. The first derivative of QFR per distance has to be above 0.025. Then you know that you have a serious gradient. The problem is that the PPGI, the diffuseness of the lesion, influence the QFR post-PCI. When you have a diffuse lesion with a PPGI low, you can do whatever you want, you will not fix it. And that's very sobering, and I'll show you a few examples. And then on top of that, you have the microcirculation that we judge by IMR more and more post-PCI. So this is an example of a three-vessel disease, right, LAD, and circumflex. And they did a good job in the RCA and the LCX, but they put clearly an oversized stent in the LAD. So what happens with the QFR? QFR in this case was 0.96, the whole vessel is blue. In the circumflex, the whole vessel is blue, QFR 0.94. But here with this oversized stent, post-PCI was 0.83. What you could expect is that these two have no event for 2 years, but this one came back with a terrible edge, stenose proximal and distal. That was anticipated. So the problem that we have more and more in interventional cardiology is that we realize that the predominant diffuse lesion, let's start by the predominant focal lesion. That's a predominant focal lesion with a major gradient. That's very good for us. The predominant diffuse lesion with a gradient is much more difficult for us. We should not touch the predominant focal without major gradient. We should probably not touch the predominant diffuse disease with no major gradient. That's the cartoon. You can evaluate that by the PPG index, and you can evaluate by the DFFR. I'll show you two examples. Difficult to see the pressure wire here, black on black contour, but anyway, this is a case where the QFR drop largely, very quickly drop. And the first derivative of this drop is very intense, okay? So the QFR PPGI is 0.9, above 0.78, and the QFR is above 0.25. This is perfect for us. You put a stent on that, and you normalize the hemodynamic, and you have a good outcome in voce, and the angina pectoris disappear. But what about this patient? You could see the transition between the blue and the red is very quick. It's focal, very focal. But look here, blue and green, and then yellow, and then orange, and then red. If you look at the PPGI curve, is a linear going down. If you look at the first derivative, there is a small derivative here, a small derivative there, and a small derivative there. Where are you going to put your stent? Where? You're not going to put 100 millimeter of stent because you know this is bad. Yeah? So this is for us a big dilemma that we have to understand. Is that a patient who will do better with pharma? Difficult to say. You have to know that for the surgeon is also a problem, because when you put a bypass on this diffuse disease, you don't improve the patient, okay? So that's really something which is a new dilemma, a new problem for us. The value is 0.78. Here it's a value below 0.78 for the PPGI. This is for example. This is an example of somebody who have a QFR of 0.78. You have to treat the vessel. You have to treat the vessel. Fortunately, the transition from blue to orange is very focal. The PPGI is high, 0.89, and there is a very important gradient, the first derivative. So that's a good case for a focal treatment with a stent, okay? This patient is also focal. You see a sudden transition from blue to green, but as you could see, the QFR is still 0.86, and the gradient, the first derivative of QFR, is 0.22. Maybe you can let this patient in peace and try to give with drug. This is a predominantly diffuse with major gradient. Again, very difficult. It's a curve that goes all the way down with the first derivative, which is not so high. You could see the color blue and light blue, indigo, yellow, red. Where are you going to put your stent in that curve? And this is even worse because there is no major gradient. The value is quite this. So on the vertical axis, we use that parameter, the delta QFR, and on the horizontal, we use the PPGI. And now I'm finishing by telling you that in the first 1,400 treated vessel of Talent, that's a half of the patient, we use this QFR from two companies, the Medis and the Pulse. And as you could see in this patient, in the multi-talent, we have 19.1% of the patient who have a QFR below 0.91. We could not do better. Maybe we could have improved some of them, but I'm sure that there are some diffuse disease that we could not have. This is the model that we have from SYNTAX II with the QFR. You see the value of 91 here. If you have a QFR above 91, your Doce voce goes down up to less than 5%. But if you remain post-PCI with a QFR which is below 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, then there is an increase in the rate of event. Now, applying that model and applying what we have in the half of the patient, we have predicted that the voce vessel-oriented composite endpoint will be 6.1% in the multi-talent, which is a very, very good score. And then I'll tell you that, again, in the multi-talent, 1/3 of the vessel in the multi-vessel talent have a PPGI above 0.78. That means a focal lesion for which it's easy to obtain to normalize the QFR, and that will result in a good voce prognosis. 1/3 of the vessel in the multi-talent had the PPGI below 0.75. That means a very diffuse disease for which it's very difficult to obtain a QFR above 0.91 with stand, and that means potentially a poor voce prognosis. You could see that below a PPGI of 0.65, the chance to get a QFR above 0.91 drops dramatically, and the prognosis of a bad voce prognosis increases. One word about the microcirculation. Okay, FFR, FR, you can look at the epicardial vessel resistance, but you have all these microvessels finally in capillaries. Now, there's two ways to assess that. The difficult way is to use a pressure Y, to have thermodilution and bolus of continuous infusion, and have an assessment of the microcirculation, the IMR. But we have developed with Escanet an angiographic version of that. So you can get, you see the formula here. Basically, you use the QFR and the proximal pressure, and then you can calculate the microcirculation resistance, which in this case is 28. The norm is 25. So the norm is 25, and the IMR above 25 indicate a microvascular dysfunction. So this is absolutely fascinating, is that today, at the end of the procedure, you could say, hey, that guys will have a good result. They have a QFR above 0.91, and the IMR, the microcirculation, is below 25. They will have a good result, no doubt about that. This patient, the interventional cardiologist has done a good job on the epicardial vessel because the QFR is above 0.91, but the IMR is 0.25. So there is already something in the microcirculation. It might be diabetes, it might be hypertension, all kind of things. So I expect some patient with residual angina, despite the fact that you did a good PCI. This is the worst group because you have the QFR below 0.91 and the IMR above 25. That's 5.3% of the patients, small number, fortunately, but I'd expect a problem. And here it's a little bit unclear. The QFR is below 0.91. The IMR is fine. Maybe we should have done a good job, a better job, and we will have eventually some TVR. So this is the current result. You see our prediction is not too bad because the repeat revascularization currently in 1,238 patients is 4.84%. That's much better than FAME, SYNTAX II, SYNTAX I, and global leaders. And you see the majority is re-PCI, and the definite stent thrombose is also very low, 0.40, to be compared in FAME 3, 0.8, SYNTAX II, 0.7, SYNTAX I, 2.6, and global leaders, 0.8. The last two slides is the big news, in the sense that we are planning, and it's very difficult, I don't know if we will succeed to convince everybody, it's the SYNTAX IV, which is a non-inferiority of CCTA versus ICA, conventional angiography in left main and three-vessel disease. And you have this three-vessel disease, and you randomize between CCTA, and in the CCTA, you have the FFR CTA, you have the IVUS-like composition, you have the myocardium at risk. This is conventional. You can do whatever you want, IFR, FFR, IVUS, etc. And we will respect the heart team decision in the United States and in Europe. What is very important is that SMT consider to have in that study the use of the IDE FDA for left main and three-vessel disease. And as you know, I failed 2 times. I failed with SYNTAX, and I failed with Excel, okay? But now I think we are in a better position. So that's something which we'll do in Europe and in the United States. There will be the CCTA approach and the IC approach randomized, and then we will do PCI or CABG. And I could see SMT is the IDE holder. The trial sponsor will be probably the University of Galway. We will have the Corib lab to analyze all the complex things. MICRA is a CRO in New York, and we hope to do this trial. I think that you will try to convince the board to do it. So in conclusion, I learned a lot from the 10 years follow-up, and some of this finding in my mind was unexpected for me or even paradoxical. Some of these findings can be counteracted by prospective measures, but not all of them. If you are a female, you are a female. We are not going to make a transgender to improve the result of the PCI, of the result of bypass surgery. We have integrated all these improvements in the SYNTAX II, and that's what we are applying in the multivessel talent. So the surgeon has declared, William Waynes and the surgeon have declared that what we have done in the SYNTAX II was the best practice. The score, the selection of the patient, the IFR, the FFR, the IVUS, the monotherapy with aspirin, the expert in CTO. So we try to duplicate that in the multivessel talent, but not with the pressure Y, by replacing the pressure Y by the QFR. So you have seen that we have no novel angiography derived hemodynamic. You have heard PPGI, you have heard the derivative. We better understand what to do with the diffuse lesion, because that's a big challenge for interventional cardiology, surgery, and primary prevention. And finally, the good news is that maybe the supraflex screws will be used in the SYNTAX IV as an IDE FDA, and that will give a supreme credibility to the device and will facilitate the entry of the device in country which is not yet using that device. Thank you very much. Yeah.